Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm delighted to welcome a viewer in Brazil, one of our regulars we imagine is on holiday. Welcome to you. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Pam Fox, and I'll introduce Pam in just a moment. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as always, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Can I also draw your attention to the chat facility? This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded. It will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next day or so. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. Pam Fox is a social historian and a full-time author specialising in Jewish history. Several of her books published over the past decade have been based largely on oral history interviews and have produced rich and engaging narratives. These have included The Jewish Community of Golders Green, A Social History, published in 2014, and Pam's sixth book, Jews by the Seaside, the Jewish Hotels and Guest Houses of Bournemouth, which she is speaking about this evening. Pam, we are eagerly anticipating your presentation, so without further ado, over to you.
Okay, let me find it. There's that up there, okay, Jonathan?
Perfect.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been really looking forward to this event. I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes, and I really hope that you enjoy my presentation as much as I enjoyed writing this book. It was really a labour of love. The talk that I'm going to give is going to be in three main parts. I'm going to talk about the rise and the decline of the Jewish hotels and guest houses of Bournemouth. Then I'm going to spend a little less time, but still walking through three different aspects of hotel life: the food, religion, and entertainment. Then I'm going to be sharing some of the stories which are included in the book, which I hope might be the highlight and prompt lots of memories for people. I understand there'll be time at the end for people to ask questions, but if you don't get your question in, I'm really happy for you to email me afterwards, and there on the screen now is my email address. And perhaps, Jonathan, you could pass that on to people if they'd like to get in touch with me. So starting right from the very beginning, I managed to trace the first Jewish holidaymakers in Bournemouth back to the late 1870s. There were just a handful of that at that time, but there were two main types. The first was a small number of people who went to Bournemouth for what they called the season, i.e. the summer months. They largely left the urban communities to spend time in Bournemouth. And this small group usually owned their own houses in the area. However, the bigger group were Jews who started to go to Bournemouth for health reasons. At that time, Bournemouth's main raison d'etre was as a resort for convalescent people, mainly people with respiratory diseases. But I came across this wonderful quote in the Jewish Chronicle in the early 1880s from a man called Mr. Godella, who announced to the world that he was going to Bournemouth to recover from the effects of exasperation, which I thought was a wonderful statement. This latter group, who didn't have their own houses or apartments, stayed to begin with in what were then called boarding houses. They were nothing special. They were usually a couple of rooms in people's houses. But interestingly, the very first places where Jews stayed were run by non-Jewish people who advertised in the Jewish Chronicle, saying that they, quote, made arrangements for Jews, or they knew a thing or two about kosher catering. But obviously the first Jewish visitors to Bournemouth were not comfortable with this situation. They wrote to the Jewish Chronicle about the need for kosher establishments. And by the early 1890s, the first kosher establishments started to appear in Bournemouth. And the two first ones were the two named on the screen here. The very first one in 1892 was a little boarding house called Lundy, which interestingly was run by somebody called Reverend Chotsner, who had been the first minister at the Belfast community, and he opened his house to visitors from elsewhere. Very different, though, just a couple of years later, was something called Merivale Hall, which stood in its own grounds. It advertised as having commodious chambers and talked about cuisine rather than food. And for that reason, I really pick this boarding house out as a precursor of what was to come in later years. And just there, so you can see that these first establishments and how different they were. That's Lundy on the left, and interestingly, that building is still there and still looks pretty well like it did back in the 1890s, and it is still a guest house, even if not a Jewish one. Merivale Hall there, you can see nestling in amongst the pine trees, for which Bournemouth became quite famous. Moving on into the 20th century, those first establishments gave rise to the opening of other kosher establishments, but it really wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that there was a big growth spurt. But by this time, the kosher establishments were no longer being referred to as boarding houses. They'd become guest houses. And this change in name signified the changes that were going on. They were becoming larger, more comfortable, and they had a lot more facilities than they did back in the late 19th century. And because of the way that they were developing, they started to attract both hoteliers and guests from other resorts where Jews had previously stayed. There was a kind of a start of a wave of people transferring their holidays from elsewhere into Bournemouth. But that growth wasn't nearly as significant as what happened after the end of the First World War, when there really was a rush of new establishments opening. And the clientele who are now coming to stay in the new places were again of two types. Gone really were the convalescents who'd been there in the 19th century, and the different establishments were now catering either for people who were escaping the overcrowding workplaces and housing in the first areas of settlement, particularly in the East End. And you could see that by the type of wording in the advertisements in the Jewish Chronicle. They advertised themselves as having airy chambers or lofty rooms or sea views. You could tell who they were catering for. But the other group of people who were very different. They were people who'd already left the semi-ghettos of the East End and elsewhere, and were settling in the suburbs that were growing up on the outskirts of the big urban areas, particularly places like Golders Green in London, where they were living alongside non-Jewish peers, and they wanted to emulate their lifestyles. So they came to Bournemouth, not to escape, but to relax and to enjoy what Bournemouth had to offer. And it was this upwardly mobile group that created the kind of catalyst for the very first establishments that styled themselves as hotels rather than guest houses. And the very first 3 Jewish hotels in Bournemouth are there. Beraha, which was a lovely name for a Jewish hotel, the Trouville and Eastcliff Court. They all opened during the 1920s. And there was intense competition between these 3 establishments. If you look at the advertisements that appeared in the Jewish Chronicle, they never ran out of superlatives to describe themselves. They were the biggest, the best, the most sumptuous, the largest in Europe. They never ran out of words. And they were constantly introducing new facilities, ballrooms, warmed accommodation for the chauffeurs, hot and running seawater in the baths, lifts to all floors. There was a constant menu of new facilities, and they were always closing and refurbishing and extending themselves. However, yet more changes were to come in the 1930s, when we really see the stage being set for the heyday of the kosher establishments in Bournemouth. And the big signal of this was the opening of 3 more very large and very upmarket hotels, which were all located on the now very fashionable Eastcliff. And these were Eastcliff Manor, the Ambassador, which later became the New Ambassador, and I suspect that most people will have heard of the Green Park Hotel, probably the most famous of all of the kosher establishments. And here's some pictures to illustrate. So on this first slide, we have the Trouville, top left, Beraha, top right, and Eastcliff Court on the bottom, which opened during the 1920s. And you can see that they were quite different from those of the 19th century. But even more, you can see the difference in the establishments which opened in the 1930s. So the top left is Eastcliff Manor, the Green Park, top right, and the bottom is the Ambassador, which interestingly was the first purpose-built Jewish hotel, not just in England, but across Europe as well. I want to go on to talk about the hotels in their heyday. There was a bit of a hiatus during the Second World War when some of the Jewish hotels that already existed were requisitioned for the war effort. Eastcliff Court was used to house American pilots. The Ambassador became a place of entertainment for people in the forces, and Eastcliff Manor was largely used as a place for people who'd been evacuated to Bournemouth. But come the end of the Second World War, they burst onto the scene what retrospectively became known as the Big Eight, which included the 4 which we've already mentioned: Eastcliff Court, Eastcliff Manor, Green Park, and the Ambassador. But they were very quickly joined by the Normandy, the Langham, the Majestic, and last of all, opening in 1948, the Cumberland. And these what were now called the Big Eight, were all on the Eastcliff, within a stone's throw of each other, which therefore became known as the Jewish Mile. They became the nexus of Jewish social life. Everywhere Jews lived, they talked about these Big Eight hotels, and they were likened to the Catskills in America. They were seen as being our answer to the Catskills. And the 4 hotels, which I haven't yet shown you pictures of, that's the Cumberland on the top left, the Langham on the top right, the Majestic on the bottom left, and the Hotel Normandy on the bottom right. Let me tell you about the Big 8. First of all, their clientele. People came from far and wide across the UK to come to these hotels, sometimes travelling for several days to get there. When people talk about them retrospectively, they mention the number of rich and famous people who stayed in these hotels, from chief rabbis through to people big in the music industry or the clothing industry, and so on. But when I looked in more detail at who their guests were, the core were middle-class families. And the hotels were, to my surprise, very egalitarian. As long as you could afford to stay in these hotels and you bought your ticket to be there, you were welcome, whatever your station in life. And the hoteliers treated people, wherever they came from, like royalty. Not all the hotels were welcoming of children and young people, but when they were, the young people had a ball. They tended to move around the hotels in groups and posses, and especially as they got older, they were given a lot of freedom to do their own thing and enjoy each other's company in the hotels, and actually spent a lot of time going between the hotels. They enjoyed themselves so much that a lot of people who had been to the hotels as youngsters subsequently went back, first of all, for their honeymoons. The Big 8 hotels became noted as a place to have your honeymoon, and then later still took their own families back with them. The patterns of holidays in these places was really quite amusing. People tended to go at the same time each year to the same hotel, stayed in the same bedroom if they could make it happen, and if they could swing it with the head waiter, they sat at the same tables in the dining room. The general pattern was that families went during the summer, older people went in the winter to get some rays of sunshine, and that the more religious and actually the more wealthy guests tended to go for the Jewish holidays, because it was quite expensive to stay in a Jewish hotel, particularly Pesach, at that time. These Big 8 hotels were showy places. They were where people went to see and to be seen. And there are lovely tales of people sending down to Bournemouth van loads of clothes and shoes to wear while they were in the hotels. They catered for about 3 different changes of clothes during their stay each day. And guests were treated to a nightly fashion parade, people displaying what were then called gowns, their furs and their jewellery. And this wasn't confined to the adults. There are a lot of tales of young people who were prepared to go to stay in the hotels that had their dresses and their outfits made for them, especially for a Bournemouth hotel. About the hoteliers, the hotels were largely, but not exclusively, family owned and run. And the family had a very high profile and were very hands-on in the hotels, which gave them a warm atmosphere, which was one of the reasons why a lot of people went back again and again to the hotels. But I came across a grouping of very powerful women who were very, very prominent in running these hotels, who I gave the name the Grand Dam. The people like Faye Schneider at the Majestic, Blumenfeld at the Cumberland, Sarah Marriott at the Green Park, and so on. They were legends, and they were a force to be reckoned with. The staff in the hotels were largely non-Jewish for religious reasons. The hotels had to be run over Shabbat and the holidays, and therefore non-Jewish people were brought in to do this and to maintain the services. However, they were highly trained and highly valued by the owners. They were well paid, and I have to say well tipped. And as a result, a lot of them stayed around for a long time and became characters in their own right and well known, particularly people like Mr. Mimo, the head waiter at the Green Park, Connie, the entertainer at the Majestic, John, the porter at the Normandy, and so on. Before I move on to talk about the guest houses during the Heyday, can I check, Jonathan, are there any questions at all in the chat that I need to address?
No, I think you're okay for now.
I'm all right. Okay, let me move on. When I started work on the book, I had an objective of not just covering the biggest and perhaps the most well-known hotels, but also take a good look at the smaller establishments, right down to the smallest guest house. And I'm really pleased that I'd spent the time that I did, because they turned out to be absolutely fascinating. There were a great variety of these non-Big 8 hotels, dotted across Bournemouth, and they varied from quite large hotels that were closely akin to the Big 8 through to very tiny establishments offering just a couple of bedrooms. Compared to the larger hotels, they came and went quite quickly, some of them, but at any one time there were about 20 different establishments in addition to the Big 8 hotels. Over the period of the Heyday, these smaller establishments became larger and more comfortable as people's aspirations grew, what they expected when they stayed in even these smaller establishments. But as a historian, a social historian, I was very taken by the people who ran these smaller establishments. They turned out to be some wonderful characters, such as Mr. Rivlin, who ran the Gresham Court, which allegedly was something of a gambling den, to Mr. Gutstein, who ran the Mount Carmel Hotel, which was Heyday well before the term was even invented. There were several Holocaust survivors who ran establishments, small establishments, and very interestingly, a little coterie of former continental refugees who ran little guest houses, which were very Germanic in their atmosphere. German was spoken, German food was served, and their clientele was mainly former refugees. So they were really quite distinctive, and they gave a kind of a little different air to the different establishments in Bournemouth. The network of owners were very supportive of each other, and there was a kind of bartering type arrangement that went on. I will swap my coconut haystacks for your latkes. And compared to the big hotels, these owners of the smaller establishments tended to be much more integrated into the life of the local community. And I must mention in this slide about the smaller establishments, some holiday homes were actually very dear to people's hearts in Bournemouth. There was Branksome Dean Convalescent Home, the Dolly Ross Home for the Blind, and Carlton Dean for people with disabilities. Although they had some residential places, they also had a number of people that went for small holidays, and they advertised their holiday availability alongside the other establishments in the Jewish Chronicle. I'm going to move on the chronology to talk about the decline of the kosher establishments. It happened really quite quickly. A lot of it could be attributed to general changes in the holiday industry in the UK, with the arrival of foreign travel made possible by cheaper flights, but particularly the package holiday. Jews, like their non-Jewish counterpart, developed a taste for going abroad and for spending time in warmer climes. They realised that they could pay kaluki on the beach much more comfortably than in windswept Bournemouth. However, there were really quite specific Jewish reasons for the decline of the kosher establishments. And particularly, I'd like to mention 3 of these Jewish reasons. The first was the rising popularity of taking a holiday in Israel. After the Six-Day War in 1967, there was an upsurge of loyalty towards Israel, and people wanted to go there and holiday rather than in Bournemouth. Another reason was the increasingly stringent kosher regulations in the Beit Din, and it was becoming a lot more expensive to adhere to those regulations, and for many it no longer became possible to compete with the non-Jewish hotels because of the cost of keeping kosher. And another reason was what was happening in the nature of Anglo Jewry. Whereas in the heyday of the hotels, Anglo Jewry was much more homogenous than it was at a later stage. People wanted roughly the same thing and were willing to stay in hotels that were offering more or less the same formula. But by at least the 1970s, Anglo Jewry was becoming much more polarized. People were moving to the left and becoming progressive, and also becoming more orthodox as well. And that formula that had worked for most people didn't work for the people who'd moved. More progressive Jews were comfortable staying in Jewish hotels and eating vegetarian, whereas the more orthodox Jews didn't feel comfortable in the traditional type of offering in Bournemouth. The guest houses were the first to disappear, and they did it very rapidly. What they were offering was no longer fashionable, nor could they offer the type of facility that people were aspiring to. And a lot of them became either care homes or small blocks of flat. However, hot on the tail of their demise, the Big 8 also started to close, or at least were no longer kosher establishments. As early as 1960, both Eastcliff Court and Eastcliff Manor closed. At the beginning of the 1970s, the Langham and the Majestic closed, or at least were no longer kosher hotels. And then at the beginning of the 1980s, the Green Park and the Cumberland both closed as kosher establishments as well, which left the Normandy and the what was now the new ambassador, and they were very different type of establishments. But by this point, while the new ambassador maintained the kind of formula that had been popular in the heyday of the Big Eight, and managed to attract a lot of people who still hankered after what had been around a couple of decades earlier. The Normandy became very, very orthodox and started to attract increasingly orthodox people. So two very different kinds of establishment. But what's important to point out is that although there were a lot of the formal both guest houses and hotels closed, there was still a very strong Jewish holiday trade in Bournemouth. It was just that its nature changed. People were no longer staying in the hotels or guest houses, but there was a huge growth in self-catering accommodation. People who either bought their own flats or hired ones to stay in when they went to Bournemouth. And a lot of the people that used this kind of self-catering accommodation had been the former people who'd stayed in the hotels. There was still very much a loyalty to being in Bournemouth, even if it was on different type of accommodation and for second holidays rather than for main holidays. And actually, that's pretty well the situation as it exists today. The main holiday trade is people staying in self-catering. The only difference is that the main guests are now Haredi rather than middle of the road Jewish people that epitomise the heyday of the hotels. There are still two kosher hotels, the Normandy, which is very orthodox, as I mentioned, and it was joined in 2005 by the Water Garden, which likewise is very orthodox. Pausing before looking at different aspects of hotel life, Jonathan, any questions in the chat?
We have a question from Irene Glausic. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Irene. Is Pam Fox aware of the group holidays hosted at the New Ambassador Hotel? The Association of Jewish Friendship Clubs had an annual group holiday there, eagerly awaited each year.
Yes, I do know about them, and they're mentioned quite a lot. After the ambassador was left as the kind of last stalwart of the big kosher establishments, that's how it maintained a lot of its clientele, by welcoming both coach parties and group holidays. There were a lot of also religious type bodies that held their conferences there, and people like charities also went to the ambassador. Lots of conferences there.
That's all.
Okay, right. Well, I hope there's some nice questions when I get to the end. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about three different aspects of hotel life. But I need to preface this bit of my talk by saying that each of these different aspects of hotel life are worthy of a presentation, each in their own right. Particularly the one about food and eating. It won't come as any surprise when I tell people that the chapter on food in my book is by far and away the largest chapter in the book. And what it describes is how when people stayed in the hotels, it was like a 24/7 eat-a-thon. People segued from one large multi-course meal to another. And even when people weren't actually eating, they were either thinking or talking about food. Each of the hotels had their specialities, such as the Green Park was famed for its 34 choices of marmalade at breakfast, or the meringue swans at the Normandy, and the rather love it or hate it giblet pie at the Ambassador Hotel. But also famous in the hotels were the Shabbat Kiddushin, when the tables groaned under the weight of food to be served just an hour before the large luncheon, which didn't stop people partaking heavily of the food. And also the very famous late night buffets, which were served around 10 o'clock, particularly in the big hotels, for people who didn't think that they could make it through to breakfast. Moving on to entertainment and the pursuits that happened in the hotel. To begin with, the main entertainment was quite traditionally Jewish, particularly around betting. I was very surprised to find what a big betting and gambling culture existed in some of the hotels. And also card playing was such a big thing. Whether you played bridge or kaluki was much more important about people than where they came from in life. But over time, the hotels became noted for their incredibly lavish entertainment programs. A lot of the bigger hotels had their own orchestras and their own band leaders. Many of them employed gigolos to dance with people. And a lot of quite famous entertainers started their careers starring at a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth. But I can't leave this section on entertainment without mentioning the word shidduch. A lot of people went to Bournemouth with the particular aim of either finding themselves a partner or to finding a match for their offspring. And a lot of people actually made met their future partner staying at a hotel in Bournemouth. And thirdly, religion. Quite obviously, Judaism was an integral part of hotel life. But the hotels did vary a little bit in the extent of their observance. Some of the hotels, particularly perhaps the Green Park, were known to be more orthodox than others. People were largely very respectful of the rules and the ways of life, but there were some incursions and people that didn't quite meet the rules, but the incursions were always discreet. The larger establishments employed a shoma to regulate the kosher regulations, and many of these shomrim became well-known characters in their own right, like Mr. Wolfson at the Green Park, Reverend Finigstein at the Normandy, and so on. They were well-loved characters, and for their part, getting a job in a hotel in Bournemouth was like dying and going to heaven. It was a wonderful end of career for many of these people. Some of the larger establishments, particularly the Big Eight, even had their own synagogues within the hotels, which were used both on Shabbat and during the religious festivals as well. I'm going to move on to a very different bit of my presentation from there, to share some of the wonderful anecdotes that typify my book. I interviewed over 100 people for my book. And some people more than once. People were very generous at their time, and I was told the most wonderful stories, and they really bring the narrative alive. And I'd like at this point to introduce my husband, Michael Hart, who's kindly offered, perhaps in inverted commas, to be my narrator. What I'm going to do is introduce each of a number of stories, and then he's going to read the excerpts from the book. So starting with the first one, in the decade following the Second World War, some of the smaller guest houses really struggled to provide appetizing food for their guests. They really struggled with the rationing, and at best their menus could be described as homely. One day when I was in the process of writing the book, a lovely woman called Diane Langlaben phoned me and she said, "I want to tell you this story." And here's Diane's story.
My parents went to Bournemouth on their honeymoon in 1946. They stayed in one of the guest houses there. My father was deaf, but one of his great pleasures in life was eating. The food in their accommodation was awful. He decided they couldn't stay there any longer. My parents went upstairs. My father asked to borrow my mother's lipstick. He used it to paint spots on his face and on his neck. He went back downstairs to explain to the owner that they had to leave because he wasn't feeling well. Seeing the spots, the owner was only too pleased to let them go. So they packed their bags and they moved to the Green Park. The following night, they went down to dinner in the dining room. And while they were eating, to their absolute horror, they noticed that the guest house owner was also dining there. They were quite embarrassed, but it was clear the guest house owner didn't like his own food either.
Nice story. The next one, I mentioned in my earlier presentation that the people who stayed in the hotels, religious festivals, tended to be perhaps the more orthodox and perhaps the more wealthy, affluent people. But there were some exceptions, as illustrated by this story that was told to me by Barbara Glynn, who is the daughter of the Marriott family who owned the Green Park Hotel.
So one lady phoned up and she spoke to my Auntie Ray. She liked coming to the hotel for the first 2 weeks in June. Auntie Ray pointed out that this year Shavuos would fall during that period, and knowing this lady wouldn't want to be there for the festival and have to pay the extra cost involved, she suggested that she choose another time. After a prolonged argument, my aunt said rather sarcastically, "Perhaps you'd like me to phone the chief rabbi, ask him to move the date of Shavuos this year." And the customer replied, "Oh, would you?"
What I quickly learned when I was talking to people is just how many things can go wrong in the running of a Jewish hotel. And this next story is quite long, but I really recommend sticking with it. It's worthwhile.
So this is Jewish Faulty Towers, I think. I remember once when Mimo was on holiday, Mario and I were left in charge, and a customer came up to me and said, "Nina, I'm coming in September. I want a birthday cake, but please don't wait for us to finish dinner. Bring the cake as soon as we sit down and give our order." So I went to the pastry chef I told him I needed the birthday cake, 6 people, September. On the day of the birthday, the restaurant was full. I said to Mario, go and get the cake straight away. And he went off, but he didn't come back. I went to see what was happening, which I shouldn't have done really, because I was in charge, but I found Mario in the patisserie. He said, I can't find the cake. It's nowhere to be seen. I said to myself, what am I going to do? I went into the kitchen where the Polish chef Nicky was working. He wasn't too bad with cakes. I told him, Nicky, drop everything. You're going to make a cake. I left him to it. I returned to the restaurant. Time passed, but the cake didn't appear. I went back to the kitchen to find out what was happening. Nicky told me he didn't know how to write happy birthday. So I showed him how to melt chocolate and use the icing tube to write happy birthday. But he forgot the H and he wrote happy birthday. With a palette knife, I removed the lettering. I spread on another layer of buttercream and I wrote happy birthday on a piece of paper for him to follow. Back in the restaurant, people were starting to leave. Still the cake didn't arrive. I went back to the kitchen once more, see if the cake was ready, which it was. And Mario picked it up. He opened the door and dropped the cake on the floor. I was now sweating with panic. We put the cake back together and we took it to the restaurant. The band were having a break. The room was deserted apart from the table of 6 people waiting for the cake. The guest who'd ordered it looked at the cake and said, looks like it's been on the floor. I said, how did you guess? He laughed. Otherwise, he'd have had to kill me.
I mentioned about the very powerful Jewish women who ran some of these hotels. And I think the most powerful I came across was Faye Schneider. And I was lucky enough to interview her daughter, Shirley Davidson, who told me this lovely story about her mother.
And my mother once went to visit the Catskill hotels in America to see how they operated. The man who was giving a guided tour of one of the hotels knew who she was and kept saying to her things like, we have 3 pools. I don't suppose you do. And we can seat over 1,000 people in our dining room. How many do you seat? So when he said, I don't suppose you have anything like this, she got fed up and said, oh, yes, we do. It's called Butlins.
Imagine her saying this. I mentioned the Shabbat Kiddushin just before lunch on Saturdays when people crowded around the tables. And a lovely interviewer called Hetty Marks told me this story.
There were so many people who crowded round the Kiddushim. It was sometimes difficult to get to the food. Once when we were staying at the Majestic, my husband managed just to squeeze his way in to try and procure a fish cake for me. Just as he was putting his hand toward the plate, an arm reached across him and almost speared him. He escaped injury. But after that, he stood back, well back, until those hungrier than him had taken what they wanted.
Some of the stories that I was told came from sources other than my interviews. Look, such as this lovely one that I picked up from the Jewish Chronicle.
So the Reverend Samuel Wolfson was the religious supervisor of the Green Park, where the crockery and the kitchen utensils are all marked either in red or in blue for milk or for meat. And he was talking to one of the directors in the hotel lounge one day when water suddenly poured down from the ceiling from an overflowing bath. Mr. Wolfson told a porter to bring some bowls from the kitchen to catch the water. And the man came back empty-handed and said, "Kitchen wants to know, sir, do you want red bowls or blue bowls?"
And finally, a lovely story, and this was kindly sent to me by the people who made the Green Park film, which many of you might have seen, and it goes like this.
So it's a husband and wife overheard through a bedroom wall at the Green Park. The wife said, "Maurice, shall I put on my Dior or my Balmain dress?" And the husband said, "The Dior." And the wife said, "Maurice, shall I put on my blonde wig or my red wig?" And the husband said, "Your blonde wig." And the wife said, "Maurice, shall I put on my diamonds or my rubies?" And the husband said, "Your rubies, but hurry up or we'll be late for breakfast."
So that's just a selection of the many, many different stories in the book, and why I enjoy writing Jewish history. So that's probably enough speaking from me. It's your turn now. I'd love to hear people's questions, and even more, I'd like to hear people's memories of the hotels.
So thank you so much, Pam. Absolutely fascinating and lovely to hear some of those anecdotes. And there are many, many more in the book, which I can highly recommend. Now, we do have a few questions. Elizabeth Dennis says, "I used to stay at the Normandy in 1965, and I knew Belle King. Is her family still running the hotel?"
They're not still running the hotel, but they're very much in Bournemouth. One of my interviews was Simon Keane, who's Belle's son, and he had some wonderful stories which do appear in the book. Yeah.
Okay. Helen Fraze asks, did you do any research into Talbot Heath, a school converted into a summer school for hundreds of Jewish teenagers in the 1960s?
It's mentioned in the book, but it's just in passing. There was something in one of the chapters about the number of summer schools in the area, and that was mentioned as one of the venues.
Okay. This is from an anonymous attendee. What was the problem the London Beth Din had with the Big Eight and their kosher supervision? Was it their approach to observance? Were they not happy with the level of observance of the owners, and as such they insisted on resident supervisors?
I don't think so. I don't think there was any particular problem. It's just felt to be necessary. I think that it was about equality as well, that I think that if some people had to have it, I think the Beth Din really wanted all of them, but not all of them did. Actually, I probably misrepresented that. For example, the Normandy, which we've just mentioned, didn't have its own shoma, but most of them did. Yeah.
So people would sort of use their discretion. They might trust the owners, or they might.
Yeah, well, that's very much the case with the guest houses, because they couldn't afford to employ a shoma. So it's very much about kind of trust in the individual owners. Yeah.
Leon Collins says, "Do you think the eating pattern of the hotels has been taken over by the cruise liners?"
Oh, absolutely. And I actually make that comparison. People segued from out of the Jewish hotels in Bournemouth and onto the cruise ships, and they probably didn't notice the difference. A lot of people who stayed in the biggest hotels actually didn't move very far from the rooms there, so perhaps it wasn't such a big difference to go to the cruise ships.
Well, we don't have any more questions at the moment. We have lots of compliments and comments, which we'll share with you. So thank you so much for being our guest this evening.
Pleasure.
It's been really fascinating. Oh, hang on, one has just come through now. Were there Jewish hotels and guest houses elsewhere in the UK?
Oh, absolutely. So Bournemouth was a bit of a latecomer in terms of hotel life. There were hotels in other areas such as Brighton and Folkestone, etc., well before the mid 19th century. And the particular Jewish resorts were places like Whitley Bay in the northeast, St Anne's in the northwest. Jews went to Brighton, but they also went to places like Eastbourne, Westcliff on Sea, and so on. And some Jews actually continued to do that for some time, even after the heyday of the Bournemouth hotels.
I certainly remember St Anne's as a young child. I also remember Margate,
Margate.
where we stayed in a kosher hotel. And were some of the hotels more ostentatious than others? Did some Jews go to social climb and get in with the right crowd? I think Laura Green will need to read your book.
There was a real sort of pecking order with the kind of possibly the Green Park at the top, but the Cumberland a close second, and some people went straight for the Green Park, but some people made their way up the ladder as their careers developed, and or their children left home and they could afford to stay elsewhere. What's really interesting is that those big hotels really knew where they were in the pecking order, and there was even a kind of system where each year the Green Park set its costs, its room costs, and then the others fell in line behind them. Cumberland was 5 shillings less, and so on down the line.
Fascinating. So this is the book. It's packed with anecdotes, lots of interesting facts. Actually quite amazing how so much information could be written about a subject which people might assume doesn't actually have that much to say about it, but there is a vast amount of information in here, and it's well worth a read. It actually really takes you there, and if, like me, you never had the privilege to stay in these hotels, you get a really good feeling of what it was like. So we're sending out a follow-up email tomorrow. There's a link on there if you want to buy a copy. If you use the link, it'll earn Milim a few pennies, but the book won't cost you any more. Now, to say thank you, Pam, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action in Israel. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. And that segues quite nicely into our next event. So we're off next week for the bank holiday, but the week after, on the 25th of April, I will be speaking about my photography for Magen David Adom and how it led to me being part of a mission rescuing Ukrainian orphans on a specially chartered flight from Poland just a couple of weeks ago. So please do tune into that. Visit our website at milim.org.uk to book your tickets and also to sign up to our newsletters to make sure you don't miss anything. All Milim events are free, but you can make a small donation. There's a link in the chat if you want to help with the cost of putting on these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Pam Fox, once again. Thank you so much, Pam, for being our guest. And the Milim team would like to take this opportunity to wish all our friends a happy and a kosher Pesach. I'm looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.